But as we moved deeper into the shifting corridors, it became painfully clear that the manor was no longer merely a backdrop to our investigation. It was the puppeteer pulling the strings. The hallway ahead stretched out like a twisted serpent, its familiar wallpaper peeling and curling in new places, the ornate molding warped in impossible angles. We paused, exchanging uneasy glances, each step forward feeling like a betrayal of the last. Maya's voice broke the silence, sharp with frustration. My EMF readers are going haywire. The readings spike and drop in a way that makes no sense. Her hands shook slightly as she toggled through settings on her handheld device, but no amount of fiddling could steady the static that crackled through the speakers. The flickering of the old chandeliers above cast elongated shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shadows that danced just at the edge of our vision. Samir's usually steady frame betrayed him now. I caught the tremor in his grip as he tightened his hold around the flashlight, the beam jittering wildly as his breath hitched in his throat. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, eyes wide and scanning the dark recesses beyond the dim light. I swallowed hard, the cold air pressing against my skin as a faint, indistinct whisper seemed to ripple through the hall. It was impossible to pinpoint. Was it the wind, or something else entirely? Our surroundings seemed to conspire against clarity. Doors appearing where none should be. Corridors folding back onto themselves like the walls were breathing. Dr. Evelyn Marks stood slightly apart, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The skeptical edge that had defined her since our arrival was still present, but I saw it falter as a soft murmur echoed close to her error voice, barely audible, calling her name. Her eyes darted around, searching for a source, but finding none. The rigid posture she maintained softened, uncertainty flickering across her face. This can't be real," she murmured, more to herself than to us. "It is," I said quietly. "We're caught in the manor's design. It's not just the physical structure, it's the house itself, reshaping and reshuffling to trap us." Jonas stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense, fists clenched at his sides. "We need to stay focused," he said with a low growl. "Panic won't help us." But panic was already setting in. The manor was feeding on our fear, twisting it into a tangible presence that lurked in the shifting walls. Our attempts to map the layout felt futile. Every corridor we marked vanished or morphed when we weren't looking. The concept of a fixed place was slipping away, replaced by a labyrinthine nightmare. I reached for my journal, hoping to find grounding in the familiar act of recording. But as I flipped through the pages, the words seemed to shimmer, rearranging themselves before my eyes. Was the house altering my memories? Our reality was crumbling, and with it, our trust in what we knew. Maya's voice cracked as she said, "I thought I could explain this scientifically. I thought I could prove there's a rational explanation. But this defies everything I believed." Her confession hung heavy in the stale air. Even the skeptic was bending under the weight of the manor's influence. The team's cohesion frayed, fear gnawing at the edges of our resolve. I tried to steady my breath as the shadows curled tighter around us, the house whispering secrets we could barely comprehend. The question echoed in my mind: how do you fight an enemy that changes its form the moment you look away? And as the walls shifted once more, swallowing a corridor whole, I realized that the true horror was not just the house itself, but the way it was unraveling the fragile threads that held us together. The manor was no longer just a place. It was a predator, and we were caught in its gaze. But I promised myself, even as dread seeped into my bones, I would find a way out, or die trying. And with that, we pressed forward, into the shadows among us. I sat alone in the far corner of what had once been a sitting room, now reduced to a husk of faded grandeur. The silence around me was thick enough to choke on, but it was not empty. It pulsed with a subtle, oppressive presence that seemed to seep from the very walls. My mind was a chaotic theater, memories tangled with hallucinations, each indistinguishable from the other. I blinked, and the dim outline of my sister's face flickered before my eyes, only to dissolve into the warped silhouette of the manor's ever-shifting architecture. The boundaries between what was real and what was conjured by this cursed place were dissolving like mist. I rubbed my eyes and forced myself to breathe steadily, grounding my thoughts. "Get a grip," I whispered to the empty room. But the words felt hollow, swallowed by the thickening air. Elsewhere, Lila was a fragile figure, trembling against the cold stone wall of the hallway. Her long, dark hair clung damply to her pale face. Eyes wide and glassy as ghostly whispers wove through the air like silk threads, caressing her ears with voices only she could hear. Her trembling hand clutched a sketchpad, the charcoal lines jagged and frantic, depicting faces contorted in silent screams and shadowed forms that writhed in the corners of perception. "Leela," I called softly, approaching her with cautious steps. Her gaze flickered briefly to me, but it was as if she saw through me, caught in a reverie that bordered on terror. "We need to stay together." She nodded faintly, swallowing hard as another shiver ran through her. "They're here," she whispered, voice breaking. "They want to tell us things, but it's like a scream inside my head." Maya was hunched over her laptop in the main hall, her fingers flying across the keyboard as her sharp eyes flicked between graphs and screens displaying the manor's erratic electromagnetic fluctuations. She was arguing again with Dr. Evelyn Marks, whose skeptical gaze was steady and unyielding. "You can't explain this with science," Maya insisted, frustration thickening her voice. "These readings are off the charts. Something is here, Evelyn. Something beyond any known phenomenon." Dr. Marks tightened her lips. "Or it's interference, faulty equipment, or your imagination. We need concrete evidence, not conjecture fueled by fear." Jonas stood near the entrance, broad shoulders hunched as he scanned the doorways that seemed to shift subtly in his peripheral vision. His vigilance was a thin barrier against the mounting paranoia. "We can't afford to split up again," he said gruffly, voice low. "This place plays tricks. We stick close, watch each other's backs." Samir's voice cracked from the adjacent room, panic barely contained. "Guys, my Girit's going haywire. The cameras are glitching, and the audio's picking up static like screams. I can't tell if it's the house or my mind playing tricks." I moved toward him, the hairs on my neck prickling as the shadows seemed to pulse and shift with every step. When I reached him, his face was pale, eyes darting wildly. "Breathe, Samir. We're all feeling it." The manor was alive, a slithering entity feeding on our fears and memories, twisting them into nightmares we could not escape. Each crack in our sanity widened, threatening to swallow us whole. That night, sleep was a battleground. The line between dreams and reality blurred until I no longer knew if I had ever truly closed my eyes. Faces from my past haunted me, my sister's laughter echoing, then fading into anguished cries. The manor's corridors twisted endlessly, folding back on themselves in impossible geometries. I woke, gasping, drenched in cold sweat, the candle's flame flickering wildly before sputtering out. Lila's whispers became screams, her sketches more frantic and chaotic, revealing glimpses of the manor's tragic history in grotesque detail. Maya's skepticism was faltering, her scientific mind grappling with phenomena that defied logic. Jonas's protective stance grew more desperate, and Dr. Marx's skepticism began to waver in the face of undeniable evidence. We were fracturing, each fissure in our minds mirrored by the manor's shifting walls. The house was not just a place, but a predator patient, insidious and merciless. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus. "We have to hold on," I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. "If we lose ourselves here, the house wins." But the question loomed, heavy and relentless. How much of us would remain when the dawn finally came? That night, the house ceased to be a mere structure of decaying wood and stone, becoming instead a crucible of our darkest memories, manifesting our traumas in ways so vivid and intimate that escape felt impossible. Jonas was the first to falter. We had been exploring the narrow west wing, a segment of the manor that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its walls subtly shifting, hallways elongating and bending like the limbs of some grotesque creature. He lagged behind, his broad frame tense, eyes darting nervously as if chased by unseen shadows. Then it happened. The flickering light of his flashlight caught a figure at the end of a corridor, an apparition. Indistinct at first, but gradually sharpening into the unmistakable visage of a fallen comrade from Jonas's past military unit. The man's eyes held no anger, yet his silent accusation was palpable. Jonas froze, his breath shallow, the echo of distant gunfire and shouted commands reverberating around him. I could see the weight of survivor's guilt pressed down on him like a physical force, his body rigid with anguish. The apparition reached out, fingers trembling, but then vanished, leaving Jonas trembling and speechless. Maya, ever the rationalist, tried to shake off the encounter, retreating to her equipment to analyze the anomalies we were witnessing. But the manor had other plans. Her recorder, which had been sputtering, static, suddenly played back a distorted video of her mentor's final moments. Mentor lost to an unexplained event that had haunted Maya since her youth. The image was fragmented, the audio a cacophony of whispers that seemed to weave into the fabric of the manor itself. Watching the footage, Maya's confident composure cracked. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she was lost between scientific curiosity and raw emotional pain. The house had found a way to pry open her carefully guarded skepticism. I found myself drawn to a quieter, shadowed room where memories of my sister lurked like ghosts. The walls here seemed to pulse, closing in with an oppressive weight that pressed against my chest. Suddenly, a spectral vision appeared, my sister's face, blurred and shifting, her voice a fractured whisper that twisted with each syllable. The memories she spoke of were not the comforting ones I had clung to, but distorted fragments that morphed into nightmares. I reached out, desperate to hold on to the truth, but the vision slipped through my fingers like smoke, leaving me haunted and raw. Leela was barely holding herself together. I found her hunched over her sketchpad in one of the manor's rooms that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Her hands shook violently as she tried to capture the surreal images flooding her mind, spirits entwining with the walls. Faces pressed against glass that wasn't there, and shadows that moved with intent. Around her, the air felt thick and alive, charged with a spiritual turmoil that was almost suffocating. Her breath came in short gasps as she whispered to unseen presences, her anxiety bleeding into the room like a tangible force. Dr. Evelyn Marks watched all this with a mixture of skepticism and growing concern, while Samir's usual nervous energy was replaced by a palpable dread. The manor's influence was fracturing us, isolating us within our own fears and memories. As these hauntings unfolded, the manor pulsed with a malevolent hunger, feeding on our trauma and growing stronger. Its shifting architecture was no longer just a physical barrier, but a psychological prison, a maze woven from our pain and fear. Each manifestation seemed tailored, a cruel mirror reflecting the darkest corners of our minds. We tried to regroup, but the strain was evident. Conversations faltered, eyes avoided each other, and trust began to erode. The house was winning, and with every passing moment, the line between reality and nightmare blurred further. I found myself clutching my journal, my only fragile anchor to sanity as the house whispered its secrets through the walls. The night stretched endlessly, filled with shadows and echoes, with memories turned to monsters. The question that gnawed at me was clear. How could we possibly defeat a force that knew us better than we knew ourselves, one that thrived on our fear and fractured pasts? Our survival depended not just on physical escape, but on confronting the broken fragments of our own souls, a terrifying prospect in a place that dreamed with the memories of the lost. As dawn threatened to break, the house fell silent for a moment, as if watching, waiting for us to break. But we were not done yet. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the dread and despair, a stubborn flicker of resolve remained. It was far too loud to be the wind, and far too deliberate. The others stirred, each stirred by the same creeping unease. The oppressive silence that usually clung to the manor was shattered, replaced by a cacophony of whispers curling just beyond the edge of comprehension. They seemed to seep from the very walls, a susurrus of voices blending into a sound that was at once intimate and alien. "Did you hear that?" Maya's voice broke the tension, her practical tone barely masking the tremor beneath. Jonas was already moving, his broad frame blocking the dim light from the hallway as he scanned their surroundings with a soldier's vigilance. "Stay alert," he commanded, voice low and steady. But even his calm couldn't mask the crack in his armor. I sank back onto the weathered armchair in the corner, the fabric worn and threadbare, and pulled my journal from my jacket. It had become my anchor in this place, the one tangible thing I could cling to as reality warped around us. But the pages, usually filled with my neat, careful script, now bore strange addition scriptic warnings I was certain I hadn't written. My heart thudded painfully as I traced the unfamiliar words, their meaning a puzzle wrapped in menace. "Look at this," I murmured, drawing the others close. Maya leaned over my shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the pages. This isn't possible." "Maybe someone tampered with your journal," Samir suggested nervously, twisting the baseball cap in his hands. But his words sounded hollow, even to my ears. As we tried to rationalize the impossible, the manor seemed to respond. Doors slamming shut in distant corridors, the floorboards creaking beneath invisible footsteps. It was as if the house were listening, reacting to our every thought, our every whispered plan. Maya's equipment whined in protest, the electromagnetic readings spiking wildly. She cursed softly, tapping at her devices with frantic urgency. "The house is interfering with the tech. It's like it knows what we're trying to do." Leela stood nearby, her pale face drawn tight with fear. She clutched her sketchbook, the trembling of her hands betraying the calm she tried to project. "It's not just the house," she whispered, eyes darting to shadows that no one else seemed to see. "It's alive, it's aware." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. A sentient entity feeding off our fear and memories, twisting them until we were prisoners of our own minds. The room shifted subtly, the corners darkening, the walls seeming to bow inward. The air thickened, stifling and cold. The manor was no longer a place we could simply explore or escape. It was an adversary, a predator stalking us within the labyrinth of its own design. "We need to stick together," Jonas said, his voice a lifeline in the growing chaos. "This thing wants to isolate us, to pick us off one by one." "But how?" Maya asked, eyes wide. "If it can rewrite our memories, change the layout, and even alter what we write, what's left that's real?" I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to focus. The journal in my lap was both a weapon and a weakness. If the house could manipulate even my written thoughts, then the line between what was mine and what belonged to the manor was dangerously blurred. A sudden crash from the hallway made us jump. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was mocking our fear. Leela's voice trembled as she began to chant softly, her mediumship a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. We moved as one, a fragile unit bound by desperation, trying to navigate the shifting corridors that no longer obeyed the laws of logic or memory. Each turn brought new terrace phantoms of the past, distorted reflections of ourselves, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. In the quiet moments between the chaos, I returned to my journal, searching for clues in the cryptic warnings that now filled its pages. The house was speaking to us in its own twisted language, and we had no choice but to listen. But hearing was not the same as understanding, and understanding was the only way out. As the manor's walls seemed to close in, I realized that the fight was no longer just to escape the building, but to reclaim our minds from its insidious grasp. The house was listening, and it was waiting. I forced my eyes open, the dim light flickering around me like a dying flame. Tomorrow we would try again, but tonight all I could do was write, because if the house could change what I wrote, then maybe, just maybe, I could change how the story ended. And that was a promise I intended to keep. Outside the faint glow of the manor's windows, the night deepened. Somewhere, far from the prying shadows and shifting halls, the world continued unaware of the nightmare trapped within. But inside, the house whispered, listened, and waited for its next move. And so did we. The recorder lay between my knees, headphones snug over my ears, and I strained to make sense of the sounds that emerged from the tiny speaker. At first, there was only static, a faint hum of electrical interference so familiar, almost comforting background noise amid the palpable unease that had settled over us like a suffocating fog. But then, beneath the static, something else stirred, a low, distorted whisper, fractured and alien, weaving through the white noise like a thread of cold, dark silk. I jerked upright, heart hammering, as the voice saw whatever it was seemed to curl around my consciousness, tugging at the edges of my reason. It was unlike any familiar language, more a texture than a message, a sound that slid just beyond comprehension, teasing the limits of perception. My fingers trembled as I fumbled to rewind the playback, desperate to confirm what my ears had caught. Dr. Marks's earlier scoffs echoed faintly in my memory, her rational skepticism, a tether I'd clung to since we stepped inside this accursed manor. But now, that tether frayed dangerously. "Elliot," Maya's voice broke through the silence, trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. She crouched beside me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You need to hear this." I handed her the headphones, watching as she pressed play. The same indecipherable murmuring seeped out, as if the manor itself had whispered to us through the fragile veil of technology. Maya's scientific rigor had been a steady force within the team, her questions probing and precise, her faith in evidence unshakable. Yet now, as the strange sounds filled the air, I saw the flicker of doubt in her gaze, the subtle shift in her posture that betrayed a shattering conviction. Jonas appeared at the threshold of the hall, his broad frame casting a looming shadow. What the hell is that? His voice was rough-edged with suspicion. Some kind of trick? Maya shook her head, swallowing hard. No, I don't know. It's something else. Something not natural. The room seemed to close in around us, the walls pulsing faintly like a living organism. Samir hovered near the equipment, pale and wide-eyed, clutching his baseball cap as if it would shield him from the unknown. Dr. Marks emerged from the shadows, her expression unreadable but her skepticism now tinged with unease. We need to consider all possibilities, she said carefully, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. But this defies everything we understand. Tensions ignited like kindling in the dry air. Jonas's protective instincts flared, his distrust sharpening into accusation. We can't just accept ghost stories. We need facts, not phantoms. Maya's reply was swift, her voice edged with frustration. And you think ignoring this will help? We're trapped in a place that twists reality. Maybe it's time to admit that not everything can be explained by science alone. The group fractured in that moment, the fragile unity splintering under the weight of fear and uncertainty. I watched as old wounds surface: Jonas's distrust, Maya's crumbling skepticism, Leela's retreat into silence. The Manor's malevolent presence pressed in, exploiting every fissure. Lila, pale and trembling, withdrew to a shadowed corner, clutching her sketchbook like a lifeline. Her fingers traced frantic lines, capturing the visions that haunted her sleep and waking hours alike. "It's coming," she whispered, eyes darting wildly. "The house is showing me something terrible." I approached cautiously, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around us. Her drawings depicted a dark, looming figure, an embodiment of the Manor's sentient malice, waiting patiently in the shifting shadows. Her voice quivered as she warned, "We're running out of time. This confrontation, it won't wait." The weight of her words settled over me, a cold certainty in the pit of my stomach. I returned to my journal, the familiar act of writing a fragile anchor amid the chaos. But even as I scribbled down fragmented thoughts and observations, the Manor seemed to pulse with awareness, the warped doorway nearby throbbing with subtle life. Outside, the night deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of hope. Inside, the house whispered promises of terror and despair, feeding on our fears as it prepared to claim us. We stood on the precipice of something irreversible, the line between reality and nightmare dissolving beneath our feet. As I closed my journal, my hand shaking, a single question echoed relentlessly in my mind. What were we truly facing inside the house that dreamed? And would any of us survive the answers? The breaking point had come, and there was no turning back. The oppressive silence of the Manor was shattered by a sudden, sharp crack echoing through the hall. Maya yelped, dropping her equipment, the eerie recording still playing faintly from the speakers. Jonas spun toward the sound, muscles tensed, eyes scanning the shifting shadows. "Stay alert," he barked, voice low and urgent. "This place isn't just playing tricks anymore." I felt the cold sweat bead at my temples, each breath shallow and uneven. The Manor's walls seemed to breathe around us, expanding and contracting in time with the pounding of my heart. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of movement was magnified, feeding the growing dread that wrapped around us like a suffocating shroud. Maya's hands trembled as she tried to recalibrate her devices, her fingers fumbling over buttons with a desperation that bordered on panic. "There's something here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Something alive." Lila's eyes met mine, wide and haunted. "It's more than alive," she murmured. "It's waiting, watching, feeding on us." I swallowed hard, feeling the fragile threads of our sanity unraveling. The Manor was no longer just a place, It was a predator, a sentient entity that had ensnared us in its web. And as the shadows lengthened and the whispers grew louder, I knew the true nightmare was only just beginning. We gathered in the cramped command center, the flickering glow of monitors casting harsh light on weary faces. Maya played the recording again, the strange, indecipherable sounds filling the cramped space with an otherworldly presence. "We can't ignore this," she said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "It's proof the manor is more than just old wood and stone." Jonah shook his head, jaw clenched. "Proof or not, we need to find a way out before it's too late." Dr. Marks adjusted her glasses, her usual composure shaken. "We must remain objective," she said firmly. "Fear clouds judgment." But the walls seemed to close in, the air thick with unseen menace. Lila's whispered warnings echoed in my mind, the sketches in her book a haunting roadmap of the horrors to come. I looked around at my team, fractured, frightened, but still fighting. We faced a darkness that defied reason, a house that dreamed in shadows and fed on our very souls. And in that moment, I realized the only way forward was through the nightmare itself. As the chapter closed, the manor's pulse quickened, the shifting corridors humming with anticipation. The breaking point had shattered our illusions. There was no denying the house's sentience, no escaping the creeping dread that clawed at our minds. Ahead lay a confrontation that would test our sanity, our courage, and our very humanity. And I, Elliot Harper, was determined to see it through no matter the cost.